Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us virtually for another Filmmaker Tuesday. My name is Jeremy Aguilera Gaudet. I'm Project Manager for Education and International Programs at Film Independent, and I'm very excited that you could join us for tonight's event, Making the Most of Your Budget with State Tax Incentives. We hope that tonight's event can help you sharpen your strategy when it comes to maximizing your budget and making sense of all the various programs in different states around the country. Great. So I'm really excited. I now want to introduce our speaker for tonight. Ryan Broussard is Wrapbook's VP of Sales and Production Incentives. He has worked with productions of all sizes, from the largest studio features to the smallest independent projects, to help them optimize their production incentive strategies and make the most of their budgets. And tonight, he'll be sharing some of that great knowledge with all of us. So, welcome, Ryan.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Um, so thank you guys so much for having me. Thank you for Film Independent for hosting this, and always a pleasure to talk to filmmakers of all types, ones that are totally fresh to the scene of incentives and budgeting for those things and preparing for those things, as well as some seasoned veterans as well that are maybe looking to see what's changed over the landscape in the course of a year, a few years, whatever, the last time you've used incentives. So let's get right to it. I'm going to, hopefully everybody can see my screen. Here's what we'll be covering today. So we'll do my little quick introduction. We'll go over some basics of incentives. We'll talk about what's changed with production incentives over the last year, especially the last 8 months. There's been quite a few changes. Remember, with these incentives, they change periodically. Every state is different. Sometimes they run off a fiscal year, sometimes they run off a calendar year. When legislative sessions happen, they're being voted on just like any bill in any state. So they change quite a bit, and this session was a doozy. There was quite a few changes in some very landmark states. So a lot to cover today. We'll do a little rundown of states that didn't have giant changes, but just a few to be aware of. And then, of course, as Jeremy mentioned, we'll do a Q&A at the end. So do make sure that you're using that Q&A button on the Zoom. We'll try to get to as many as we can, and we'll go from there. So with that said, the introduction. This is me. I'm Ryan. Some people call me Bruiser. I've been in the industry for about 18 years, 18 plus years at this time, and I've worked for a variety of production payroll companies. And as Jeremy mentioned, I've worked with studios, large and small, and even independents that you wouldn't even think they could qualify for incentives, and then as large as productions as like Jurassic World and whatnot, and helping them with incentives. So the scale is certainly very large when it comes to the people that are utilizing incentives and that I've worked with. So I am the VP of Production Incentives and Sales at Wrapbook. I joined Wrapbook about 2.5 years ago when I just saw the rapid pace of innovation that Wrapbook was on with developing software, leaning into AI, doing a lot of interesting stuff from a Silicon Valley point of view to help you with your production accounting and finances. So that's my introduction. So moving on, the basics. So I assume that some people have used tax incentives before, and then maybe some people in the audience maybe have not, and that's okay. That's part of the reason that we're here, right? That's why we do these educational type webinars. So let's talk about some of just the basics, because we're going to be mentioning some terms throughout while we're talking about these states that have changed and the key factors of those states. And I want to make sure that everybody is kind of up to knowing what these things mean. And you've probably heard these things around. If you know these things, great. It'll just be a refresher. So the basics. Why do people have tax credits and tax incentives? So states have tax incentives to maximize their economic return when a show goes there. I've always said it's kind of like an economic bomb when a show goes to an area, because they're spending their per diem, they're staying in hotels, they're utilizing the restaurants, the local vendors, etc. So states want to have those shows come there to utilize that. That's why, Georgia loved it when Walking Dead was there for a very, very long time. And, when Maryland had House of Cards, and like Tennessee had Nashville, like they want to hold on to those things because it's perfect for consistent payroll, consistent economic impact. So that's why they have these things. When they create their incentives, not every incentive is the same. In fact, none of them are the same. Every single state is like a snowflake. They're all very different. They all have very different requirements in order to get into that incentive, which we'll talk about shortly. But as far as the basics go of the types of incentives they have, there's only a few. So first, we'll talk about the tax credits. So tax credits are exactly what they sound like. They are credits to use to offset tax liability from a corporation. Okay. So when you are a production, whether you're an independent or a production company, and you go to these states, you want to, maximize the incentive to offset your liability in the state. But if you're going to that state, you probably don't have any liability. So you have to figure out what to do with that credit. That's what the credits are, okay? And there's three types of basic at the core. There's three types of credits. One is transferable, okay? Transferable, which is like what Georgia is and Illinois is, and quite a few popular states, Connecticut. That basically means that when you get that credit, you can't use it, right? Because once again, a credit is used to offset your liability, but you can transfer it to somebody that does need that credit, right? So if you're in Georgia, you could transfer it to, I'm just throwing it out there, Delta or Chick-fil-A or something of that nature, where they might need those credits to offset their liability. And why would they buy it from you? They buy it from you at less than on the dollar. Okay. So it's kind of like a Groupon. Remember those things? It's like, oh, I'm going to buy $20 worth of $40 at a restaurant. So same deal. They're going to buy your $1 million of tax credit at 90 cents on the dollar. So you get $900,000. They get $1 million of tax credits to use to offset against their liability. So that's how transferable works. So that's a lot of states have that. So when you're budgeting with a transferable tax credit, it is very crucial that you have to make sure to, from a cash flow, cash value perspective, account for that discount. So you always want to put a discount what your credit is worth. If you're going to Georgia, you're not getting that true 30%. You have to transfer it. Okay. Refundable, you don't need to transfer it. They see if it offsets your liability. You do a tax return for your show, and then the state will issue you back a check for for your credit. So it's usually dollar for dollar. So technically, it has more value. Refundable can take more time than transferable, because transferable you can get off your plate quicker. So when you're budgeting for refundable, it is dollar for dollar, but you want to certainly budget for the fact that you might be sitting on that credit longer because you can't move it as faster. So if you got a loan against that credit, you might need to factor in the interest longer than it would be for a transferable credit. Okay. Non-refundable, non-transferable. So it can't do either of the ones we just talked about, which means you can't transfer it to somebody else. You can't get a check back. It's not refundable. You can only use it to offset your liability. So what that means is you can only use it to, if you owe, certain taxes in that state, you can only use it for that. So this has the least amount of value in states, unless you're a studio in California, right? Then you've got that liability, you get that non-transferable, non-refundable tax credit, and you use it to offset your liability there. Then probably the easiest to, I guess, digest and to even understand are grants and rebates. No tax credits, no transferring, no nothing. This is like a pot of cash that the states have set aside in their budget, and you get this if you meet those minimum criteria in those states. These states usually are not funded nearly as much as the tax credit states. So when you're looking at these type of states, or you're budgeting for these types of states, like a Texas or a North Carolina or whatever, the first thing you want to do when you're looking at your budget and you're like, oh, we're going to North Carolina or Oregon or whoever it is that has the rebate or the grant, the first thing you want to do is find out, do they have money left? Because that pot of cash just goes right out when people have it. So that's very, very important. But it is the easiest and most lucrative of these incentive types. Other terms that you should be aware of are residents and non-residents. So if you don't know, when we're talking about these states that we're about to go into, a resident is somebody that lives in the state that has that incentive and is working on a project in that state. A non-resident is somebody that lives outside the state but comes and works in that state. So just remember, anything with these incentives is always boots on the ground. You cannot, in any of these territories across the United States, qualify for a certain state if somebody's working outside that state. It doesn't work that way. It's boots on the ground. So keep those terms in mind. The last term is project criteria. Once again, every state's going to be different. So some states require you spend $1 million. Some require you spend $500,000. Some require you film 50% of your principal in the state. Every state's going to be different. But when we talk about minimum spends, meaning how much you have to spend there, or project criteria, that's what we're referring to. Okay, that was a lot. I promise I won't talk that much on every single slide, but I wanted to make sure we kind of went through that before we kind of delved into these states. So, what is new with production incentives? So, here's the states that we'll be talking about today. These are all states that had drastic changes over the last 8 months, and you need to be aware of if you're budgeting or planning for an independent or doc or whatever it might be in the next upcoming year. Once again, these things could change next year, but that's just the nature of these tax incentives. So I do these types of roundups, webinars through a variety of outlets, and I'm very thankful to be doing it with Film Independent. You can always keep track of the incentives and be up to date by going to the Wrapbook website. Under resources, we have our incentive center. I have everything up to date there. We're updating that periodically. We keep track of all the bills as they're going through. So be sure to follow that as we're going through. Okay, so New York, a big one, right? A very popular one. They have been trying to better their program, and let me rephrase that. They have been bettering their program for the last 4 years. On paper, New York was always a terrific program. Just last year, it could go upwards of 40%. It's fully refundable. So remember what I talked about before with that. Residents and non-residents can qualify there. And above the line can qualify as well, which means, your talent and whatnot can qualify. But they've made some significant changes over the last year. The biggest issue with New York in the past has always been the waiting period to get back the credit. New York has always been, to be frank, the longest, upwards of 5 years. About a year and a half ago, they changed it. They alleviated the wait period to file the tax return. They increased their office staff and they increased their funding. Now they've doubled down on that. They've increased their funding even more. They've upped their percentages now to where it can get to 50%. Never thought I would say that for a state in the United States, that it gets, especially New York, that it could get that high. Keep in mind that's if you film upstate New York, because they have bonuses there. So there's always, in a lot of these states, there's always like the base incentive, and there's always these bonuses you can kind of piggyback on top of each other. So you can get, that's why you see that range at the top there, because it's 30 to 50%, depending on where you're filming and if you capitalize on these bonuses. But the biggest changes they made, which is pretty pretty perfect for this type of audience, is they now have an independent film carve out. And it's more than just a carve out, it's kind of a separate program. So it's a pilot program. They're trying it for the first time, just dedicated to independents. They're only going to be trying it for 3 years. So that's pretty interesting. And they set aside $100 million of their total $800 million of funding just for the independents. They've defined what independents are, so you can't have 51% of the connected to a company that's publicly traded. And they've pooled the two together. So if you're 20 million to 100 million, then you're going to have a certain set of money set aside, and then if you're over that, then you're going to have a certain side of that 100 million set aside as well. So they're trying to, California had something similar to this, still has something similar to this, and they're kind of mirroring this with their independent film tax program. It is capped, and it is very different from its regular production program in the sense that it's got application windows. Usually New York doesn't have that. Very important for your budget as well. If you're budgeting for New York and you're an independent and you're trying to get this independent credit and you miss the window, well, you're going to either have to go for the other production offering that New York has, or you're going to have to wait till the next window. It is a first come, first serve system. So a lot of these states will talk about sometimes do a case by case basis. This is first come, first serve. And so once they're out of money, they're out. So, that's another thing. Once again, if you are budgeting for New York and you're an independent and you're later in the year, you're going to want to call them, because if you're doing a $10 million show and you think you're getting back, 40% of that, they might say, yeah, normally we would, but we only have $1 million left in the pot. So we'll give you $1 million. So you need to be very conscious of how much money is left when planning and budgeting for New York. The credit and for this particular program also is based on uh, the completion year as opposed to the allocation year. That's very important too. The allocation year is usually slower because it's later on. It's when it's allocated, when the funds are allocated out. That's when you have to do all the tax ramifications. If it's the completion year, as soon as you're completed, you can get the ball rolling. So you should, by nature, get the credit much, much faster. Um, they also launched a Production Plus program. This is super interesting too. More and more states are starting to do this, where they want slates of shows, right? It's very smart, where they say, hey, we will incentivize you even more if you do two or more projects back to back in this certain area. And New York is doing it as well, which is really interesting. I spoke to a few auditor friends of mine. They suggested always go for it. There's no downside for it. So if you're doing an application in New York and you think, hey, I might have another project in the next 12 months, go for it. Like, say, hey, we're going to do it. And if you don't do it, okay, no harm, no foul. But if you put it on your application and it happens, then you can get this 5% bump or this 10% bump, depending on how much combined production spend you have in that state. It gets, obviously pretty high with the $100 million one. But if you're just doing 20 million between two or three shows, which is possible with independents, you can get that extra bump. So that's pretty interesting. And I'm really happy to see New York kind of thinking outside the box of what they normally do. Their standard program, so the way it's always been in the past, they just call it the production credit. That still remains. It's funded at 700 million annually, which is great. The upstate bonuses that I talked about, you can still capitalize on. And yes, all these things I'm talking about with the upstate can be applied to that independent credit as well. So you can get the upstate and all that stuff with that. They used to have a compensation cap on above the line, meaning that they would cap your actors, directors, of how much they would incentivize them for. They got rid of the individual cap. It used to be $500,000. So if somebody was making over $500,000, boom, they were cut off. Now it's just the aggregate cap that remains. And the aggregate cap meaning like a combined total of what your below the line and total New York expenditures are. That's how much above the line expenditures you can qualify. So once again, super interesting. I mean, who would have thought that New York would need to incentivize above the line, get rid of individual caps, start, getting upwards of 50%, doing carve outs for independents. I mean, this shows you that between New York and California, that they really want the business back, and that change is happening. And the reshuffling of whatever we're going through right now is we're in the middle of it. And independents should really take note of New York. Um, the last thing I'll say about New York is, once again, the faster payouts is real. No more 4 years. We still don't have a timeline of what it is though, because this is so new. So we don't know if like this is going to say, oh, your payout's going to be in 18 months now, or what it's going to be. But it'll certainly be faster because they pulled all those levers to do that. They also have a commercial incentive and a post incentive that remains intact. That has not changed. So if any commercial producers or people that rely heavily on post are out there, those incentives are there. New York is a super amazing place for incentives. The one thing that I wish they had for my documentary makers and unscripted makers is they still don't incentivize any type of reality or unscripted. So, but who knows? There was a bill out there that was floating around to get docs added to it. It hasn't gotten any traction. It's just kind of been dead in the water the last like 2 months, but at least they're thinking about it. So, right as we kind of go through the map, New Jersey, a state that has not had an incentive years ago, came back a couple years back. They weren't sure how to come back. They were gone for a very, very long time because of a certain show. I won't mention which one, but hey, it's New Jersey. And they came back in a very, very big way. So they rewrote their program completely when they came back a couple years ago, and it's been extremely popular ever since. Every year since then, so like the last, I guess, 3.5 years, 4 years, it has gotten better and better and better, and they just keep restructuring it to make it better for all parties, studios, independents, and now even unscripted stuff. So that's really interesting. They just doubled down on that and extended the program to 2049, which is a date I can't even fathom. Um, but here we are. Now they have this studio production partner program. Currently, Netflix is one of their production partners, and Lionsgate is one of their production partners, and they have room for one more production partner. We're not sure of who that will be just yet, but they get certain advantages over just the regular us regular folks that are just making regular productions in New Jersey. But don't worry, don't fret. The program is still great for New Jersey for us regular people. The project criteria there is you have to either shoot $1 million worth of expenditures in the state or 60% of your production expenses. So that's great. Because a lot of times, especially when I do these types of webinars, a lot of people say, where can I go for $100,000 or for $500,000 or whatever, some of these small things where they think they can't qualify or have no clue that they can. Well, you can, and even a state like New Jersey, as long as you hit that 60% parameter. So it's either or. Ironically enough, for unscripted projects, they were set aside because they were trying to not fall into where they did years ago. And they had special rules for unscripted where they had to do the 60% and the $1 million, both. And they recently changed it. So now they live like the rest of us, so to speak, and they can do the either or scenario of 60% of the expenses or the $1 million. So that's great, and they just need a 4 episode order. They have restructured their bonuses. We talked about bonuses earlier. They used to have a diversity bonus that was very popular, especially because it did include women as well as people of color. So it was pretty easy to get. It was, when you budgeted for it, most everybody I saw that had a New Jersey budget was putting the diversity bonus in there. The uplift, it was 2%. They've gotten rid of that, but they've shuffled it in for 3 other bonuses. So now they have a relocating TV bonus, a 4% for promoting New Jersey bonus, and then a 4% for hiring from a distressed area bonus. There's not a ton of rules around this yet. This is so brand new, right off the right off the pot. So this is super super new. We don't have all the rules and guidelines of it yet, but certainly you can capitalize now to get upwards of 39-40% in New Jersey, which is terrific. It is a transferable credit. So once again, you're going to have to sell that or work with a broker or somebody like myself who works with brokers to move that credit, right? To say like, oh, we're getting back $1 million in credits. What do I do now? So then we find ways to move that, get that to somebody where they'll give you the cash. I usually tell people try to do a buffer in your budget of like 11%. We can usually beat that, right? Most people can beat 11%. It's all about supply and demand. I remember when Georgia was super duper busy, I saw the credit go as low into the 70s, but I've seen it also as high as the mid 90s. So it really just kind of depends on how many credits are floating out there and supply and demand of those credits. So sometimes it's hard to budget for that, but I always try to be very conservative when doing budgets for a transferable state. All right. They also changed their above the line cap. So they rose that to 750K. So there still is a cap, but it's a lot higher. They've got some other like new criteria that they've added, but once again, we're waiting for more details on that. They did change the filing tax return to the issuance date and not the application date. Huge change, because basically everyone that used to file in New Jersey used to have to go and amend their taxes because it was based on when they did the initial application. Now it's based off of the issuance date. So you don't have to do that amendment. So that's a huge weight off people's backs after they've applied in New Jersey. So going down the map to Georgia, a very popular area. We've heard Georgia is so popular over the last decade or more. Tons of Disney, Marvel stuff filmed in Georgia. So where are they at? So if you've never filmed in Georgia, the incentive still remains intact in the sense that it is up to 30%. That bump of 10% is, there's a screen credit, and there's also like these check boxes you have to do of like, I did this, I did that, and there to get the 10%, it's not very hard. So most people get the 30%, but it is transferable. So just like we talked about with New Jersey, you have to plan to sell that out. They did add this past legislation a post credit back. This credit had disappeared for a while, but it is back. So post facilities can now get an actual credit themselves, which is pretty interesting and great. So what I always tell people, especially when budgeting, is try to work with those Georgia post facilities because they're usually willing to give you a deal because they're getting back this post credit incentive themselves. So they can then almost end up being cheaper than your normal, post facilities that you're using. The biggest hurdle that Georgia has had over the last 3 years is they made their audit mandatory. It used to be voluntary. So they made it mandatory, which is not out of the norm, by the way. A lot of these states say you have to go through an audit in order for us to, give you the incentive. That's fine. But there was a lot of hoops on their audit, a ton of hoops. There still is a ton of hoops, but they have lessened quite a few of them. So they've updated, used to have to do like this daily narrative and bank statements every single day and just a ton of extra stuff you would have to do. They've reeled it back a little bit for the audit and made it easier for people. Hopefully, it'll be easier. They do incentivize residents and non-residents working in the state, so that's why it's a pretty lucrative incentive. Plus, they have a ton of infrastructure there. But I always just say do the math when going to Georgia. You know what I mean? Because it's a transferable credit, and you got to budget for the audit. Make sure because the audit is a lengthy process. Some people don't realize that that's a costly thing that doesn't qualify, and most states require that. So just things to be aware of when going to Georgia. Yeah. So they also have local incentives there, which we might talk about in a few other areas. So the state has their program, and then Savannah, their rebate came back. They were out of money for a while. They got refunded, and they even increased it. And you can budget that with. I'm sorry, you can when you budget, you can stack that with the state. So you'd want to create in your budget a Georgia incentive and a Savannah incentive, and you can double dip on those things. So that's pretty, lucrative to know that you can double dip. And it's a rebate, and it's a fully different application. It's not the same application. You don't just say, hey, tack on Savannah. You have to do that application separately, and it is a rebate. It is not a tax credit like the state. Okay. So Alabama is just kind of going across the map here, swinging through the South. Alabama is kind of one of those states I always say is a hidden gem. People don't think about it because they think about Louisiana, New Mexico, and Georgia when they think about Hollywood South. But Alabama's always been a key player. They're just not super well funded. They did increase their funding to 22 million, and that includes a bump now for a new music incentive that they added. So hey, I mean, we're talking about film incentives. Now there's music ones, and Tennessee now has a soundtrack one. So people are thinking outside the box, right? It's entertainment as a whole. Let's keep the entertainment in the United States, right? But they've always been a good program. They range from 25 to 35%, depending on if you're hiring residents or non-residents. So if you're a non-resident, you're at 25. If you're a resident, you can get upwards of 35, and it's fully refundable, right? So that makes it very easy to budget for dollar return. They have a pretty quick turnaround in Alabama. Their audit process is pretty easy. there as well. You still need to budget for it, but there's like one guy in Alabama that does all the audits, and it's pretty easy to get through that. So always a state, I kind of tell people, hey, did you look here? Let's see if they have money left, because if you're doing an independent, it could be well worth it. So as we move across the map, as mentioned, Louisiana, my home state, they this has been this has been a top incentive state for since the beginning. There's a lot of debate of who was first, Louisiana or New Mexico in the United States. I think maybe Louisiana was, but maybe they're tied. I don't know. And then Georgia followed. So those were the three big states that started when tax incentives first came to the United States. Um, and they've been around for a very long time. Great infrastructure. They lowered their cap this year from 150 to 125. But to be honest, they weren't totally giving out the full 150. So they're going to see how the 125 will work. The flip side is they increased the project caps, and that there isn't anymore. This is the reason that in the heyday of Louisiana, Jurassic World was there, and Planet of the Apes, and G.I. Joe, and like all these giant tentpole movies were there all at once because there was really no project cap. What I mean by a project cap is a lot of states will have project caps and basically say, hey, the most we will give you is X, Y, and Z. So the most we'll give you, the way Louisiana used to work was the most they would give you would be $20 million, or 40% of your overall budget. Okay. They don't have that anymore. So they're pretty much saying to those studios again, hey, come on back. We're not going to cap you out. You can totally maximize this incentive. So really great for those tent poles. Independents are still great because they can still get upwards of, I have 40% here, but really the way you can work it, especially if you film outside of the New Orleans bubble, and even if you use a Louisiana screenplay, you can get upwards of 50% in Louisiana. There really are some levers that you can pull to get very, very high. So there you can get 45% at the very most, at the very least, if you film outside that bubble. So a great program still in effect. It is partially refundable. This is something we didn't talk about because there's only two states that have partial refundability. So partial refundability, I know it's a curveball for you guys, basically means that you can't transfer it. The state will refund you back, but it won't be dollar for dollar. So they will discount it for you. And they discount it at 90 cents on the dollar. Now you want to budget for that. Now the good news is it's not going to vary because of the supply and demand like a transferable credit would be. So in your budget, when you get that credit and you have that credit line in your budget, you can definitely just discount it by 10% and know that you will get that. However, just be aware that certain states do have fees, and Louisiana is no different, and they do have basically an issuance fee to get that credit, which is 2%. So it's kind of a net 88 cents, but you have to pay that 2% on the front end to get back the 90. I tell you guys that because that's important from a cash flow perspective and from your budget perspective, is what we're talking about, right? Is like, key pitfalls when doing your budget for incentives. So if you're budgeting for Louisiana, you for sure want to put that 2% on a line item so that you've got that from a cash flow perspective on your budget. Cool. So now this is exciting. The reason it's exciting, and I love to see this, is because Indiana didn't have an incentive last year. So now we're starting to see some new states pop up. And that's, once again, very, optimistic. And this is like, hey, more and more things are going to drive people back. Once again, when the reshuffling happens or when it resurfaces or whatever you want to call it, there'll be more options. Now, it is non-transferable and non-refundable. So remember what I said about that. It's not the most lucrative, right? You pretty much have to have liability in Indiana. So, I mean, if you're coming from California or New York or anywhere else, you can't really capitalize on it. But this is just their way to get a toe in the door. right? This is how a lot of them will start. It's like, let's just test it out. Let's get some legislation passed, because just like any legislation in any state, think about all the things where all the places you guys live, and you hear about this bill doing this and that bill doing that. It's not easy. So if this is their way of getting their toe in the door, and then maybe next year they resurface it and change it and it becomes different, that's what's important. And this one did just that. This one is going to become, it started as non-transferable, non-refundable, and now it's going to be transferable. So it's still non-transferable, non-refundable this year, but come January, which is right around the corner, which is insane, it's going to be transferable. So this is exactly the footprint. This is exactly the model for what states do when they're trying to get their program started. They started off very small to where not a lot of people can capitalize on it, and then they can kind of just ride it out and then change it and evolve it. It's going to include residents and non-residents. It's not terribly funded well at all, at only 2 million. But once again, it's not about that. It's about getting the toe in the door. Some independent's going to come in there, and I guarantee they're going to roll out the red carpet because they've never had productions there, and you're going to get a great experience. That's what happens a lot of times with these newer states. And then they'll find success, and then they'll get greater funding, and then hopefully the snowball effect happens. Same with Wisconsin. So Wisconsin has not had an incentive for, I think, as long as I've been doing this. I don't think Wisconsin has ever had an incentive. Yeah, I don't think so. And now they do. So this comes into effect in January. They went from 0 to something, and they went in a big way. They went straight. They totally jumped over the non-transferable, non-refundable, and went right to transferable at 30%. That's what Georgia is. I mean, think about that. So Wisconsin made that giant jump. They are still waiting to roll out their rules and guidelines. So more on that to come. Once again, stay tuned to our website at wrapbook.com. We just know a few things there. The minimum spend is $100,000 if you're over 30-minute runtime, and 50,000 if you're under. So hey, all my producers out there that are doing shorts and whatnot. Who would have thought? Look at Wisconsin. So I mean, they're going to get 5 million in funding. Hopefully, we have more guidelines soon. But this is inspiring to see, right? It's just newer states, new programs, people seeing it works. They want that economic impact, and especially for independents, like find these types of states. That's what I tell clients. Will call me all the time and say, Ryan, what state should I go to for this? I've got $2 million. Should I go for that? Find these states, these ones that like will roll out the red carpet because they're not used to production. Find the states where you can talk directly to the film office. Yes, you will have trouble sometimes finding vendors and crew and whatnot, but the film office is willing to work with you. Some of these states might be open to incentivizing the non-residents that you bring in. Will Wisconsin? We don't know yet. Their bill mentions the word resident payroll and not non-resident. We'll find out hopefully soon enough. Iowa, another new one, right out the gate. Now, they did have a program way back when I first got into this industry, almost 20 years ago. You can Google it. It had some interesting hardships, which you can read about if you Google that. But it is back, and it's in a pilot program. So once again, they're trying it. It is a grant, so not a tax credit. It's just going to have the $4 million, like I said, pot of cash that you'll be able to maximize on if you meet those minimum criteria there. Once again, we don't have the guidelines yet. It is brand new. So remember, most states run a fiscal year. So that means their fiscal year ends typically around like July. So a lot of these bills, unless they get extended, are getting greenlit or okayed in July and August, and we're already, we're in September. So some of this stuff is so brand new, we just don't have the information on yet. Oklahoma has been a pretty consistent state over the last couple of years. It is a grant, and it can get upwards of 30% by stackable bonuses. They have quite a few bonuses. They did add a new category for live audiences and whatnot. They do incentivize residents and non-residents. Actually, the non-residents have to be called what they call an expatriate, So basically have some connection to Oklahoma in order for the non-residents to qualify. You can register your loan out there as well and make that qualify as an expatriate and be like an Oklahoma loan out. So there are ways around it. The biggest thing that I've come across with Oklahoma is two things. One is they don't have a project cap, which can be great for the studios, but sometimes I'll give you an example. Twisters went to Oklahoma, right? So like they filmed there and kind of cleared them out. So that was great for the people that worked on it. Fantastic economic bomb, so to speak, when they filmed there, but then they were out of money for the remainder of that year. So they are re-upping their funding with the 10 million. So that is coming back up in November. So they will get refunded. So if you are looking to go there, that would be the time to call them and start saying, what do I do about the application? Start budgeting, doing all that. They do have some local incentives that are interesting, especially the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee Nation has an awesome local incentive. I don't think I have a slide on it. No, I don't. They have an awesome local incentive that you can piggyback on top of the state incentive. So it's pretty cool. The way that it's mapped out, it's actually very, very well written. I remember when it was launched, and I worked with two independent features that capitalize on both the Cherokee Nation program and the Oklahoma State program. So yeah, it's a really good program. It's a grant, so no tax credits, which is always great, especially for independents. They do have some, and we see that we're starting to see this more and more in states. They have this apprenticeship requirement. You got to remember the goal of these programs is they want to grow their infrastructure, whether that's physical infrastructure or crew base. So we're starting to see more and more of states say like, hey, can you do some sort of apprenticeship or hire X amount of locals or bump up somebody from like, this rate to that rate or this job to that job in order to get the incentive. So Missouri has something similar. We're going to start seeing this more and more as some of these newer states and these ones we don't think about off the top of our heads, like a Georgia or Louisiana or New Mexico or the bigger states, are trying to build up their infrastructure. So Texas they were all over the place when it came this year from a legislative perspective. And what I mean by that was they were every deadline article, whatever I heard, was talking about how Texas was getting this giant amount of funding, which they did, especially from where they were coming from. So Texas is a grant program, and they were always based on a biannual funding. So, which means they used to get $50 million, and that had to last them 2 years. They're one of the few programs; they might be the only program that was set up that way. So, this past year, not only did they increase their percentages, which we'll talk about in a second, but they drastically increased their funding. Last year, they added 200 million to their funding, but it was a one-time dump of the funding. This time now it's in the bill in the legislation that this will be continuous every 2 years. So that really gives some longevity to Texas. Texas is a tiered system when it comes to percentages. You'll notice when we talk about a lot of the percentages, there's usually a base for a lot of these states and then a bonus of some kind, if that's even applicable, applicable. So with Texas, it's more tiered based. So you get 5% if your budget is between 250 and a million. You get 10% if it's a million to a million and a half, and then 25% if you're over a million and a half. All those numbers have gone up. Last year they were not that high; they were lower. So the fact that now you can get to 25 is pretty great. So that's for film and television, and then for commercials, video games, and even some reality, they don't let you get the full amount back, but they still include you in the two tiers that we have listed here. They do have some new bonuses, a couple new bonuses. So they've got they used to just have the rural bonus. So like if you filmed outside certain just areas or jurisdictions in the state, you would get it. They used to call it the underutilized bonus. Now they have some really interesting ones. Once again, it's kind of cool to see the states thinking outside the box. So they have this Texas Heritage bonus. Not a lot of details on that yet. I'm thinking that has to do with local producers, local filmmakers, connections to Texas, but once again, waiting on the details for that. They do have now a veterans bonus. They did have that before. There's a couple states that have this. Mississippi has this. I think Missouri has this. So basically, if you're hiring a veteran, you can get an extra bump on their payroll. So what you're paying them, you can get back an extra percentage back on that. They do have the historic site bonus. Brand new, haven't seen something like that before. I'm guessing if you just film at certain sites in the state, you get that extra bonus. And then a faith and it's actually called faith and family based bonus. That'll be at the discretion of the film office. So there's not a ton of details around that. I'm sure we can assume what it includes is just faith and family styled films. But the fact that there's a bonus for that is once again kind of just thinking outside the box. I haven't seen that in another state yet. So it's just, they're just trying to think of different ways to incentivize people. They now also have a post bonus if you're utilizing some post houses in Texas. So that's great to see. One of the hardest things to do when you're in some of these states is, especially if it's not one of those giant ones we're used to hearing, like I mentioned, and I keep mentioning, like the Georgias and Louisianas, whatever, is to crew up locally. Um, Especially for Texas, because they do not incentivize non-residents. So if you bring people from out of state into Texas, they do not qualify. Okay. So the fact that they used to have a giant percentage requirement of residents to even qualify. So not only did residents, they were the only ones to qualify, but you had to have at least 50%. You might have even gotten to 60 of your crew, cast and crew had to be residents to even qualify. They've recently dialed that back dramatically, once again, to hopefully kind of buzz up infrastructure and attention over there. So now it's down to 35%, which is a lot easily attainable. It will increase though every 5 years over the next 2 years. So it will get back to the 50%. But for now, as they kind of enter this new phase of their incentive, it's at the 35%. But really interesting to see them do that. I put Montana in here only because I wanted to use this as an example of when you're budgeting. Their program is paused. Their funding is paused, and this was just announced until 2029, which I had to do a double take on. So, like, their incentive is still live, but their funding is paused. And they've even still started to improve the incentive. Like now they've got credits as, reserve credits for independence, and now they're including docs and unscripted stuff. But they've paused the funding. So this is an example of, you hear there's a good program, you just want to reach out to these film offices, and all these film offices are great. Like, maximize the film offices. We put all their contact information on our website as resources. But this would be an example of one where it's like, hey, let's call there 100%. We have to find out, do they have funding before we even start this Montana budget, or we got to think about going somewhere else if this doesn't work. So you kind of never know what's happening with these states until you do your homework. I always say that's very important. Reach out to the film office, talk to people like myself. So I really wanted to kind of throw this in there as an example, as this had happened this legislative session. The last big state I want to talk about, and we'll talk about a few others like that I have peppered in what I call like the rundown, but the last big state is obviously California. And I have a few slides on this, so prepare. So this was really out of left field. So they announced the California incentive has changed dramatically over the last decade. It used to be a lottery, like a true lottery. It changed from that a couple years ago. Then they started doing carve outs for independence. Then they started saying, okay, we're going to have a carve out for independence. In that carve out, we need another carve out for independents that are 10 million and under, which was great. And then they announced that was their 3.0 program. And then they announced their 4.0 program. So we knew 4.0 was coming. We knew some of the changes were coming. What we didn't anticipate and kind of came in last minute was they threw a curveball of how high the percentage was going to get. So we knew the funding was going to be there. We knew about the now possibility of being refundable, which I'll talk about in a second. We didn't know that now you can get upwards of 45%. And when I read the bill, the 80 something page bill, I did quite a few double takes of like, I can't be reading this right. Just because I just didn't think that California could get this high. Once again, kind of speaking to New York, like, wow, New York can get that high. Wow, California is going this high. It really shows they're doubling down on trying to bring back production, right? So let's talk about the new changes in the state of California now. So 4.0 is live. They have $750 million in annual funding. That is divided up amongst a pie of television, of basically studio shows, of independents, and then independents under 10 million. So they had that divided up pretty well. It in the past, their incentive was always two things. It was either A, non-transferable and non-refundable, which we talked about, right? You can only use to offset your own liability. So that's what the studios used when they were filming in California. Or if you were an independent, they let you transfer it, like Georgia, like Illinois, like some of these other states we talked about. Um, Now those two options are still there, but now you have the ability to say, or I want to do fully refundable. I say fully refundable, but it's not. It's actually partially refundable with a 90% buyback, similar to Louisiana, right? The big difference from Louisiana is it's a 5-year disbursement. So when you elect to be fully refundable, I keep saying fully, it just rolls off the tongue. Partially refundable. It will be over 5 years. So you need to budget for that, especially if you did any type of financing against that tax incentive or you plan to get that tax incentive back. The interest on that thing and the accumulation that it's going to have over 5 years could be dramatic. So you want to make sure that you budget for that. Me personally, and the people I advise from the independent perspective, I still say transferable is the best way to go for independence. You can still get it back faster. Yes, there is a discount on it, but you don't have to wait 5 years to get it. You transfer it, you get it, you have your money back. For the studios, they have the option for refundability. Sure, they can use that, but usually they have a footprint in California, so they need that liability. But now they have the option. Okay. Some other changes they made. So it still does include resident below the line and non-resident below the line. It doesn't include any above the line though. So that's very different from New York because New York does include above the line. So California does not include any above the line. So it's mostly it is all for your below the line and your local spend of what you're spending there. They have added a couple new requirements as well. So I mentioned that New Jersey used to have a diversity bonus. California now has a requirement for diversity. Now they can't tell you what your guidelines need to be. This is where it's kind of interesting. You have to make your own diversity guidelines, basically, and you have to say this is our plan to show representation in both on screen and behind the scenes with your crew. If your goals are met, great. If they're not met, they can penalize you now and they can actually take back some of the credit on the back end. So when you're budgeting, you need to be aware of that. Maybe take it off to be safe. And then if you get it, it's a cherry on top. I'm always about, with all these incentives, to budget accordingly and conservatively. Um, they now have safety requirements. You have to hire a safety advisor, brand new role in California, something you need to have in your budget. So you need to make sure you have that. They've increased they have what they call a pilot program fee. So they've increased that. The indies are still 0.25% of the estimated credit you'll get back, but everybody else, it's 0.5% now. They did define more what an independent is. Which is good, though the way it's worded is better for independence, and I'll leave it at that without getting into the nooks and crannies of like tax liability and whatnot. This is the way they've divided the funding. So once again, if independents are watching this, a lot of independent filmmakers, they've got quite a good chunk set aside. They do have certain application windows. Their website is great. They do always, they actually, it used to just be the text of when the application windows were going to happen. Now it's an actual calendar on their website. It's pretty cool. It's an interactive calendar. So check that out on the California website. But those windows are super, super small. Like a few days, like 3 days. So there's 3 phases of an application window in California. So you have to be aware of it. Your budget has to be tight. Everyone gets into phase one. So don't get too excited. They accept 200%. I said that right. 200% of applicants into phase one. Then they start going through everybody's budget. They start going through what's called a jobs ratio, which is basically your economic impact in California. Very, very, very important to get into this program. It is not a lottery program anymore, but you are definitely pit against your colleagues and your fellow filmmakers. You guys are pit against each other of who has the better, basically, economic impact in the state. And that's what's called your jobs ratio. If you overshoot that jobs ratio, they will penalize you. If you undershoot it, you may not get into the program. So it's really important to prepare your budget and make sure that the jobs ratio is in line. The jobs ratio, the Excel, the calculator, all that stuff is on the California website. So if you have any independent or plan or budgeting a show right now as we speak, go there and explore it. You can get to the California website through Wrapbook.com as well. So talking about the percentages, the base credit is now 35%. That's insane. That's insane. We talked about, Georgia used to be belle of the ball at 30%. California's base is 35 for all types of productions. That's just crazy. It can get increased with television, and then it can get increased through some other bonuses as well. There is a caveat though, which is in order to qualify, you do have to spend $1 million in the state. That's pretty high. $1 million minimum spend is pretty high. There are other states that have that. Even North Carolina is 1.5 million. So they're not the highest that you have to spend in the state, but that's still pretty high. So don't just think like, oh, I'm doing a $200,000 short or feature in California, and now I can qualify there. Ironically enough, though, they did lessen the runtime that you needed. So it used to be, I think, 30 minutes, and now it's down to 20 minutes. So ironically enough, they lessened that, but they didn't lessen the minimum criteria, which is interesting. They increased how much both independents and all other productions can get back. So that's good. They've also streamlined all their bonuses. So they have an out of the LA zone bonus, 5%, a local labor bonus. So if you're hiring people outside that radius, you can get a certain bump depending on the type of production you are, whether you're an independent or something else. They have a visual effects bonus now, and then they have the career pathways, their newest bonus. It hasn't even started yet. We don't have all the details on it, but this is where I think now, if I'm doing the math, you can get to 47%. I laugh even saying that, 47% in California. But this has not gone live yet. The guidelines around it have not been released. But basically, it's similar to what we were talking about with Oklahoma and those apprenticeships. Like now, California's even doing that and saying, hey, we want to bring even more infrastructure here. And you have these career pathway trainees that they call them. You have up to 4 of them, and for everyone you hire up to 4, you get 2%, well, a 0.5%. So you can get up to 2% because each one's worth 0.5%. Added to your overall credit on the entire production. That's awesome. Not just on like that person, but the entire production. That's what I call like a blanket bonus. So that's fantastic. Wow, that was a lot. Okay, so it's California. I want to be conscious of time. I'll go through these very, very quickly, and then we can kind of get to some questions. So these are just some other states that a lot of people usually talk about that had some little bit of changes this past legislative session to be aware of if you've got a budget for one of these sitting in front of you. So Connecticut, I mentioned a few times because it is a very popular transferable program. They are a tiered program, similar to like we talked about with Texas, where depending on what you spend there, you can get upwards of 30% back in that transferable credit. They do incentivize residents and non-residents, and they actually have a post-only incentive. So we actually see a lot of like unscripted companies starting to set up shop directly in Connecticut. They had a bill to kill the whole program. um, Scary, especially for those companies I just mentioned. Once again, always great to monitor these bills, always great to tune into Wrapbook so we can keep you abreast of these things. It didn't go through though, so thank God that bill died. The program remains intact. It didn't change at all. Kentucky's still a great program, fully refundable. They're great base program. They incentivize residents and non-residents. They just changed around their film office name. Maryland increased their funding, or just kept their funding, I should say, the same at 12 million. They incentivize residents and non-residents alike. Nebraska had a grant. They're one of the newer ones. The grant did not do great. They've gotten rid of that, and now they're trying a refundable credit. So once again, trying to figure it out, toe in the door, what's going to work, what's not. So more rules and guidelines on that, hopefully coming. Nevada, similar to Texas. I mean, you opened a deadline this in the last 8 months or 12 months, you saw something about Nevada, how they were, this studio was saying they're doubling down on that, and that studio was saying they're doubling down on this bill. Nothing happened. They still have their current incentive, which is transferable, and I think it's like 12 to 20% off the top of my head, around that, depending on residents and non-residents. But there was some really interesting talk of how they were going to change that incentive, and it just didn't go. It just didn't go. So once again, do your homework, know where you're budgeting. Like, is it real? Is it legit? Did you just hear a bill's coming out where this person's getting an incentive, or is it an official thing? Follow me on LinkedIn. I always post the official changes when a state happens. I never post just bills. It's if you see me post about a state, it is official. Hawaii, their refundable program remains intact. They had some bills that were going to help Hawaii significantly. They do qualify residents and non-residents, but they require every single qualified expense there to have what's called GET tax or GET tax, which is something you have to budget for. You pay it as the production company, and it adds up very quickly. So speaking of budgets, if you're going to Hawaii, you have to budget for that GET tax pretty much on every single expenditure and even your loan outs that are working in the state. There was a bill to get rid of that for the sake of productions. Unfortunately, it didn't go through. Last page of the rundown. Oregon increased their funding, so that rebate remains intact. Terrific film office there. They incentivize residents and non-residents. They increased their percentages about 2 years ago. Ohio, they no longer have. But what's today? Today is the 23rd. So in a week, they're going to be getting rid of. They used to have set application windows, and now they won't. So that'll be great because now you can budget for Ohio appropriately and not be like, hey, did I miss the application window? Arizona, the program's under review. It is a newer program. I think they're just kind of working out the details of that. So more in Arizona to come. And then there are a couple bills in the works for North Carolina and even Arkansas as well to possibly change some things. So we are monitoring those. So, wow, a little. I hope time-wise I'm okay. We have time for some Q&A, and I'll catch my breath and take a sip of water. But that is all the changes that have happened over the last 8 months. If we didn't talk about a state, feel free to bring it up now that you want to talk about. Happy to talk about it. But those are the key changes that did happen.
Great. Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah.
That was a lot of a lot of information.
Yes. 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 Yes.
Um, there I see a couple questions about the ATL qualifications, the above the line qualifications.
Yeah.
And this may be different by state per state, but do the ATL qualifications include non-residents, or is it just residents only? Like the actor, talent, producer need to be resident for that expenditure to be covered under a tax refund? And similarly, does New Jersey's ATL 750,000 cap apply to talent?
Okay, so for the latter of the question, yes, the New Jersey one does include talent. So your actors, directors, any of those people, they can qualify in New Jersey, and that cap will be applied to them. So that basically means that, that's the most that you can qualify there. For the first question, you're right, Jeremy. It depends on the state. So some states will say that, like, the resident ATL, like Texas, the resident ATL will qualify, right? Tyler, where's Taylor Sheridan or whatever is doing all that stuff there. He's got a lot of people that are living there. And Texas, all those people, if they're considered locals, will qualify. If somebody from out of the state goes to Texas, it won't. But some states like a Louisiana or a Georgia or North Carolina or a lot of states will include the above the line non-residents. There might be a cap associated with it, but it unfortunately does depend on the certain state.
Um, Great. So people are asking about submitting tax incentives. So specifically if you're, making a film and sort of it can be kind of filmed maybe almost anywhere. There's a wide variety. It does not specific to location.
Yeah.
Do you recommend just applying for a bunch of tax credits and see which one you get, or is it bad to sort of apply and then be like, no thanks, I found somewhere else to go? Or is that
Yeah.
going to affect you in the future? And do you also recommend maybe some states are just easier to work with than others if you're not locked into specific location?
Yeah. Great question. Um, so I say that, you in some situations you can even get two incentives at the same time. I worked with a production that was filming right on the border of basically Louisiana and Mississippi. Now they couldn't double dip, but they could get the Mississippi rebate on their Mississippi half, and they could get the Louisiana tax credit on the Louisiana half. So you can do that. You can also do, I think it is fine and actually sometimes works to your benefit to apply in different states. So I'll give you an example. On the North Carolina application, they actually ask you point blank, are you looking at other areas? And if so, who and why? And to be honest, it kind of works in your favor if you are, because what's the point of this incentive? They're trying to incentivize you, right? Is to come there versus elsewhere. And if you're going to film in, if you're going to film somewhere just based off the narrative and you're going there whether there's an incentive or not, maybe they say, I don't need to incentivize these people. They're coming here regardless, right? But if they say, hey, we're up against another state or jurisdiction or international or whatever it might be, they might say we should incentivize these people and roll out the red carpet because we want them to come here. As far as like states being easier than others, all the film offices are great. That sounds so what but kissing their butts kind of thing. But they're all very good. They are the source of truth when it comes to these incentives. However, some applications are more complicated than others. Some I mentioned the California one is very robust. You've got the jobs ratio, you've got three phases. There's a lot to go through. You usually just have to hire like a line producer and some special people just to do that for you in California. Other states could be a very simple questionnaire. North Carolina's, you go online, you do a one pager called an intent to film, and that starts the process. Some states where the case by case basis can be drawn out. Texas has every right to say no to your film because they don't like the color of your hair or the lack thereof. And it doesn't matter because it's a case by case. They could be no rhyme or reason. If it's first come first serve, then sometimes that can work to your benefit because as long as you meet the minimum criteria, you can get into the program. So it does vary. I would just say that some applications are just, there's less hoops to jump through. Also, some applications don't require a cost, and some do. So those are just kind of all things to weigh, especially against your budget.
Right. And then, when you're doing your budget and you're applying for these, how early in advance did you start? Is this one of those things you start as soon as you know that you need to do it, or is there a better time frame?
Yeah, good question. And I hate to, I'm gonna sound like a broken record. I already know what these questions. It does depend on the state.
The state, right?
And they are going to be different. Some will say, like Georgia says, that you have to do the application before your principal photography is done. So you can wait while you're still filming to do it. Some will say it's got to be done within a 30-day window before principal begins. Some will say, Kentucky, they vote on theirs monthly. So you have to, if you want to ensure that you're going to get that, you need to make sure that your application is in an ample time to where it can be voted on that month so that you're going to have that incentive and you can budget for it. Louisiana is one of the very rare places where they say you can actually apply a year after you get your shows done. So you can actually go backwards. So when you get your allocation letter in Louisiana, they'll qualify everything either a year backwards from that letter, which is extremely rare, or 2 years forward. So you could apply now and not film for another year or so, as long as your spend falls within that 2 year window. So it really just depends on the state.
And now these subsidies, we talk a lot about fiction filmmaking. What about documentaries? Is it sort of the same? They're counted for subsidies as long as you're shooting in the state or
Yeah. Yeah. Docs, the hard part, I work with a lot of documentary
oh,
companies. And I would say that the hard part about documentaries is can they do the project criteria or the minimum spend in a state?
wait,
A lot of times they don't even think they qualify because they think, oh, we're a doc and we don't. I will
mm,
tell you, we actually recently put together an article on Wrapbook.com under our blog, and it was all the states that incentivize just docs. So I highly recommend you guys check that out. And there's quite a few states. It's actually easier to say the states that don't incentivize docs.
right.
New York doesn't incentivize docs. California doesn't incentivize docs. Um, but the problem is because documentaries move around so much,
Mm.
sometimes they just don't spend enough in the states.
And takes so long to film sometimes
And
too.
it takes so long to film.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, but you would be surprised. I mean, sometimes I was working with somebody. They were doing a documentary on mushrooms, and they were going through Mississippi, and as quite a few other states. And I said, you should go for it. The minimum spend there is $50,000. $50,000. Like you'll do, they would hit that. And they applied for it and got that section of it, even though they did just a few days of their doc there. So you never really know till you ask. And that's one of the things I put out there is feel free to ask me. I advise prospects and clients alike of, hey, it can't hurt to ask. Don't leave money on the table. I'll happily advise you on what I know about that certain area.
All right. So as far as other states, we've gotten several inquiries about New Mexico.
Hmm.
I know you were sort of just talking about states that had drastically changed over the past 8 months or so, but anything new or interesting with New Mexico?
No big changes with New Mexico, but New Mexico, as I mentioned, was still kind of one of the original, the trinity of Hollywood South when the incentives first popped up, and they're still very popular. They are a fully refundable credit. There is some things, and we'll talk about it, that is extremely unique to New Mexico. It's not a change that they've had. It's something they've had since the beginning of their program. So they do not allow for any behind the camera non-resident above the line to qualify. There is a workaround with it, but you have to be what's considered a studio partner, like we talked about with New Jersey. So basically, it's right now it's Netflix and NBC Universal in New Mexico that have this ability. But if you're anyone else that behind the camera above the line doesn't qualify, but your talent can. And the only way to make your non-resident talent, so in front of the camera, qualify is if they're a loan out, which they normally will, you have to go through something that's called a super loan out. It's very complicated. It has to do with something called gross receipts tax. If you work with your payroll company, like a Wrapbook, we facilitate this for you and work with you on it, but it does cost money. The gross receipts tax can range anywhere between 7.125% and all the way up to 12%. That's a big hit in your budget, and you have to pay it, not the individual, not the loan out. So you need to put, possibly up to 12 to 13% extra in your budget on your talent if you want to get back that 25% in New Mexico. that's a big deal. And if you've never filmed in New Mexico, it really does sneak up on people. So you have to certainly budget for that when you go in there.
Um, what about for someone's asking about auditing? They didn't budget for an audit for the audit part in their budget. Can you just talk about more like what you can expect for auditing costs and time and all that stuff and what you should include in your budget? It's
Yeah.
probably different for each state, maybe, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can't, I don't want to speak. I work with a lot of the auditors. I don't want to speak on behalf with their pricing. What I will say is this: I will say that you have to budget for 9 times out of 10 when going for an incentive state, you should budget for the audit. Some states are pretty upfront about it. Louisiana, for example, makes you pay the audit fee. They call it a verification fee on the front end, and it's $7,500. You have to pay that with your application cost, and it goes through the state. Other states basically say you have to hire a third party auditor, and that's just going to depend on whoever you hire for the audit. What I will say is the costs have gone up. And that doesn't have to do, that's not like a bruise or anything on the auditors. It's the fact that these incentives have gotten more complicated. I mentioned that about how Georgia now, their audit guidelines are pretty robust. Connecticut requires a full audit. Most of these states will do what's called agreed upon procedures, where it's like a sample audit. So, I've seen audits cost for that, anywhere between 10,000 to 20,000. But a full, depending on the size of the show, but a
Mhm.
full audit, I mean, that could be even higher because they have to go through line by line by line by line of your books. So it's put something in that line item. And once again, I'm all about being conservative. So I would put a high number in there. If you're an independent, put like 10, put like 11K if you're going for an incentive, especially in some of these bigger states we're talking about, because the stuff that they have to abide by and the guidelines and the AUPs are pretty complicated and they will add up for you.
There's someone asking also for just maybe a little more detail and more explanation of sort of the percentages for tax credit. Like if it's a 30% tax credit and you spent $3 million on qualifying expenses in production, 30% tax credit is it just $900,000? Is it or is it a little bit more complex than that?
No, I mean it pretty much is that. I mean, if we're just at its bones, at its core, it is that. It is 30% on your qualifying expenses. Now keep in mind that doesn't mean that, oh, I'm going to Georgia and I'm spending $3 million and I know I'm getting 30% back because some things won't qualify, right? Every state, once again, has specific guidelines of things they qualify. In Louisiana, airfare doesn't qualify. In Kentucky, production insurance doesn't qualify. No production insurance qualifies. So, I mean, I'm not just singling them out, but every state is a little different. In Georgia, the California SUTA on your non-residents do not qualify. Georgia, one of the hard parts with their audit is they now prorate your producers based off of their time if they're getting a flat fee based off their time in California versus their time on site at the uh, given location in Georgia. So if you didn't budget for that and you just said, I'm getting 30% on everything, I'm doing it all in Georgia, it's it's not that simple. But when something does qualify, you will get 30% of the credit back if you met all those guidelines.
Nice. So a few more states if you want to go that people
Yeah.
are asking about. We have 10 minutes. We have Washington, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina seem to be coming.
Okay. Okay. Just rattle them off. Just shoot them
Yes,
off,
yeah.
and see what I can remember. So Washington is it is a rebate program, and it's a solid program, but you know, part of the core of this discussion is budgeting. And the thing that everyone overlooks with Washington, every single person, I won't go into the nooks and crannies of the incentive, but I'll tell you this right away, is in the small print, it says that in order for any payroll to qualify, so any of the people you're paying, your crew, ATL, whoever it is, benefits have to be paid. Now, that is extremely unique to Washington. I have not seen that in any other state, and most people miss it. Um, and you need to budget for that because what that basically means is, to be frank, unless you want to pay health and 401k directly for your for your crew, somehow facilitating that, you're going to need to be union. And whether you're an independent or not, and you didn't plan for that in Washington, it can have a drastic impact on your budget. So that's my big disclaimer for Washington. They also, that state is pretty unique in that it charges um, a dollar amount extra for workers' comp, which is really unique. That has nothing to do with the incentive. That just has to do with the way the state's set up. It's very different than other states. So it's just something you need to be aware of when going for that rebate program. Um, the percentages are solid. So if you're meeting those criteria with the benefits, sure, by all means, go for it. They actually will push you kind of to the front of the line if you're utilizing and showcasing Washington in a good light. But you need to be aware of that benefits requirement because it does sneak up on you. Um, Pennsylvania is a transferable credit, and they recently upped their funding. Well, not it wasn't this year; it was last year. Um, and they do incentivize residents and non-residents, I believe, at 25%. Really good program, solid program. From a budget perspective, you need to find out, do they have funding? Because I think they get 100 million a year off the top of my head, or something similar to that, or close to that. But I mean, there's some studios that are based there, especially in Philly, that kind of have, hey, we know that these people are always making movies here, so we want to make sure that they get the money first. So you definitely want to make sure that they have the money intact. And they also have a Pennsylvania, once again, similar to the Washington workers' comp thing. They do the way they do taxes on payroll is kind of unique. And like most of the states, because I work on the payroll side, we can just kind of give like a payroll rate fringe sheet that breaks down what the fringes are: state unemployment tax, federal unemployment tax. Pennsylvania is a little unique, and like they have some extra, it's like a district tax or something like that that they have, that you want to make sure that your crew is aware of, and let them know before you go there. But transferable credit, and that one's been around for a while too. That one's one of the old dogs of incentives, so they're still alive and kicking for sure. South Carolina is a rebate, I think. That one, you might have got me on that one. I think it is a rebate. That one, the interesting thing about South Carolina is they do incentivize residents and non-residents, but they want every single loan out to register. Every single loan out to register, and that film office is going to be frank, be on phone calls every day, calling you guys to make sure those loan outs register, so that they can qualify appropriately. There's also a weekly production report that office requires. So that takes some extra man hours. That actually brings up a really good point for a lot of these states, not just South Carolina, but when budgeting for any of these types of states, South Carolina, especially Georgia, and a few others where extra accounting and financing is needed, you need to put money in your budget for your accounting. If you've got one line item for a key accountant and you're doing like a $3 million show in one of these states that has a complicated incentive, you are way under budget. You're going to need a team. You're going to need a few people. They're going to need some help because it is a lot, and your accountant is the backbone of keeping that incentive tagged in your payroll accounting system, and making sure that these things qualify so that when you do hand in the books to the auditor, they're clean and you can get back your money appropriately. So please take my advice. If nothing else, do your homework on the incentive, work with a payroll company like myself and talk to experts like myself, and please put money towards your accounting and your accountant because they are the backbone of the incentive in your show.
Nice. I think for an ending wrap-up question, if you're, especially for sort of maybe first time beginning filmmaker, you're starting this journey with maybe your first feature or just any independent feature, what would you recommend people start doing at the beginning to look at whether, how to like comparing the different rules and regulations and incentives of different states and sort of putting together, does Wrapbook have a tool that sort of compares
We
different
do.
states and like yeah and
Yeah.
how um how you would sort of just begin this journey. Any advice and recommendations?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Plug,
Because
super
it's well,
simple.
because it seems also seems very daunting, especially
Yeah,
if you're
yeah,
like,
yeah.
it's one thing if you're like, well, I have to shoot in, a certain state for whatever reason. But if you're like,
Yeah,
I can shoot anywhere on the East Coast, where should I start?
it is very true. I mean, that is the question, to be frank, and not I haven't looked at all the questions yet, but not to be frank of anybody that asked it, it is the hardest question I get because it's not always easy, which is where's the best place to go, right? That's what everybody always says. Where's the best place to go? And there is no best place to go. There is no best place to go for everybody. It is the best place to go for your production, right? Because you could go to a state where they don't allow for above the line, or their above the line cap is really low, and you're above the line heavy. So why would you go to that state? But then that state could be great for somebody that doesn't have a giant above the line, right? You could be a doc where the best state could be Louisiana, or another state. Louisiana might be better for an independent, or New York is better for the. It just depends on your particular situation, on the creative, as well as just doing the math for the show. I always tell people, don't chase an incentive. Let's just do the math first. We do have a comparison tool. It's called the Wrapbook comparison tool, and it is on the our incentive center. And you can just lay out the three states. I think you can get even higher than three, and it'll compare all the minimum criteria, all the percentages, right there on the page in the bottom of your screen. It's super easy and it's super intuitive. But definitely have to do your homework. If you really need to narrow it down to like three states at most. When you get above that, it just gets way too complicated. You need to start figuring out timing wise, like, are you getting a loan against the incentive? Because that's going to dictate, like, then do we go to a place where it takes 2 years to get it back? Or should we really shoot for a grant where we feel like we can get it back in 6 months? All of that is going to play into the state that you choose. If you're doing a $200,000 show, well, you've eliminated more than half the map, because most people's minimum criteria is 250 or above. So now you can start looking at Massachusetts, where it's 50 to 25,000, Mississippi, where it's 50,000, West Virginia. So like you can start looking at states that have a much lower minimum spend. So it's kind of all about, like, just like, in school when you would like do the multiple choice and start crossing out the words as you go to figure out that last answer. You need to go through and start crossing out the states that won't be possible for your budget, and then start playing around with, okay, does this fit the narrative, and is it cost effective for us? Um, I know that's not the exact answer of like, hey, just look at these three states and you'll be fine. But that's what it is. It's pretty vague. I would also say, don't just, if somebody says, I just filmed a show in Kentucky and it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. That doesn't mean your show is going to fit there. Same with Georgia. Like, maybe try to find the hidden gems, the Alabamas we talked about, the Mississippis. Maybe that's better for your smaller independent. Um, but you've got to do your homework and you got to do your research, because they are all completely and wildly different. Yeah.
Great. Great. Thank you. Wow. This was a very intense, like a lot of information, a lot of
Yes.
very good,
Yes.
useful information. I don't think I mentioned at the beginning, but this is being recorded and will be sent out to everyone, so that you can reference this anytime you want to start getting more information. And like Ryan said, I think Wrapbook's site sounds like it'll be a great tool to use as well. So thank you, Ryan, so much for doing
Of
this and for
course.
talking with us. And that's it. So everyone, have a great rest of your evening, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.